America has been at war with intellectualism since nearly the founding of the nation. The entire Constitution and Common Sense, Thomas Paine's work, that helped to spark the fire for independence were built on the Enlightenment, a period when individual liberty, science, progress, and questioning of religious institutions, as well as religious freedom and separation of church and state, were finally out loud and proud. However, in the post-Civil War and the British Victorian era, there came a backlash in literature against the Enlightenment, seeing it as naive, but at the same time heartless and mechanical in place of human emotion. This wasn't helped at all by the advancement of technology that sprung from the scientific revolution, when the useful arts went from being a trade secret to being taught widespread. This kicked off the first industrial revolution, and with Adam Smith's Treaty on the Wealth of Nations, capitalism also sprang from the Enlightenment. This began shredding institutions at a faster rate than had ever been seen throughout human history, and this technology was constantly changing and driving war, with new kinds of brutality and shock never before seen. Pollution became commonplace with the Second Industrial Revolution rising. Communism, socialism, anarchism struck back against the mercantilism and early stages of capitalism, realizing quite rightly that technology as it was would continue to destroy and replace jobs, destroying unions and guilds to ensure the worker would never truly own his own labor, and would be at the mercy of the unelected wealthy collective to survive. This caused fear of its own on many sides. People became disenchanted with the Enlightenment and saw it as heartless and cruel and longed for a much simpler time that never actually was. From the Romance movement and the Gothic movement as a subgenre came about the focusing on emotion and its wonders, borrowing heavily from old medieval Romance literature, talking of daring knights and royalty, idealizing and creating a past that never actually existed. Knights became beacons of greatness and chivalry, an ideal that almost no knight ever lived up to, as most were violent thugs. Good kings and queens idealizing a benevolent philosopher monarch. It created the ideal of manhood and womanhood that had never existed before, of women of virtue being always chaste, while platonic sexless relationships were the height of intellectual love. This helped strengthen gender roles and stick to the status quo, holding the Enlightenment and progress at bay. Gothic literature explored emotion, creating genres of horror, emotion, and science fiction, which helped spread hatred against the enlightened values. Feeling over thinking was much more important. As science advanced further and things like unions came to power, it began making the average person's life more conducive with science, and the Enlightenment began making more strides. In the 1960s, a kickback against the Enlightenment values actually came strongest from the left. The hippie movement discovered drugs, and that resurgence of feels over reals took its toll. War, pollution, nukes. Maybe if we all just got baked, we could find real truth and free love. The right was loving the majority of Enlightenment ideals. Science gave them more and more powerful weapons. Capitalism was booming non-stop. We controlled the freaking world. They just ignored that questioning religion was part of the Enlightenment period, and socialism was a call for individual ownership of labor through collectivism, instead of the crazy violent monster it had become, and they crushed anyone that could have provided more individual freedom. Sadly, feels over reals means you can be manipulated easily, and many of the hippies became some of the most die-hard members of the religious right after they had kids. Science started telling people what they didn't like about technology. Pollution was having health impacts. Lead was causing all sorts of problems. The 80s, like the 50s, created a new romantic revisionism, and people of the 80s often believed Leave It to Beaver and Andy Griffith were actual representations of how people acted at that time, while people at the time knew these were fictional characters meant to represent what could be, and certainly not what any reality was like at the time. At the same time, sci-fi took off, and one background theme was the importance of emotion versus logic, pitting the impulsive Kirk against the logical Spock, or a robot, denigrating all point in controlling emotions to the casual observer. Once incontrovertible proof for the dangerous impacts of climate change, lead, smoking, and other forms of pollution began showing up in the scientific literature, science began telling Republicans things they didn't want to hear, and a backlash came into effect. The internet came into its own, and the world suddenly became a lot more complex. It had always been complex, but now people could access it 24/7. They began denigrating academic elitists and conflating them with corporate elitists while idealizing the rich. After 9/11, the Enlightenment's values suddenly were okay to examine and talk about. The average person became more aware of modern science and the advancements it had made. It showed the wonderful advantages in the Enlightenment would make the world a wonderful place, using technology to live in harmony with nature if we valued that, and that emotions and empathy were key to happiness. two major factors the Romantic period promoted, but science cautioned against emotional bias and the dangers that can occur if we don't try to tame our inner beast and make ourselves aware of our own brain's limitations. Also, being able to treat many of the madnesses that the Romantic and Gothic periods idealize and reframe them as conditions as opposed to something to either glorify or vilify, and the idea that we can work to change and better ourselves flew in the face of the old Romantic notions. The Enlightenment pulled us out of the pre-Enlightened mindset where God and superstition were the answer to everything, and you must know your class and status in life, and give into it. The Enlightenment had problems because we did not have sufficient science at the time, and did not know the questions to ask of science. The Romantic period was the extreme backlash against the Enlightenment, not so much religious anymore as spiritual. But as it was relying purely on bias and emotion, the majority of it was wrong, idealistic, and revisionistic. Thanks to advancements in science, we now have applied philosophy such as secular humanism that we can use to pick out the best traits of Enlightenment thinking and Romantic thinking, and throw the rest away as failed ideas. Sadly, many people on the right, to rationalize pre-Enlightenment thinking, seem to have taken all of the trash we've thrown away and clung to it as a backlash to science. The Romantic notions must die for us to move on, idealizing of a past that never was, strict adherence to gender, race, and sexual norms and ideals, idealization of nature, relationship, and children without understanding them realistically so we can better care for all of them and nurture them. The Trump election was the backlash to this new Enlightenment push, who represents the waste products of the Enlightenment and the Romantic periods that science deems harmful. Even steampunk, unlike Civil War reenactors, has no delusion that the Victorian era was in any way a grand or noble time. It was awful, but using the aesthetics, sci-fi, and technology of the time, we can create an imaginary world that was awesome, driving us to learn more violent, harsh truths about the era. This new period, if it can get off the ground, has many names given. The Age of Reason, though the Enlightenment was called that. The Age of Skepticism, if you stick with Sagan's definition. Or the Age of Maturity, where for the first time in history, everyone could have the opportunity to grow the hell up emotionally, enrich ourselves, each other, and the planet, embrace science, and throw the Romantic and Enlightenment waste products in the garbage to be analyzed by archaeologists to better understand ourselves, our past, and our way to a better future.